Imagine a world where people disappear without a trace, vanishing in the blink of an eye. Victims lured into the hands of a monster with a chilling, gruesome method that no one could ever anticipate. But what if the killer isn't just any murderer? What if he's been living among us, hiding in plain sight, his true nature concealed behind a facade of normalcy? In the late 1940s, London was plagued by a series of unsettling disappearances. One by one, people seemed to vanish without explanation. At first, the cases seemed unrelated. Ordinary individuals leading ordinary lives, all gone, leaving nothing behind but questions. But as the investigation deepened, the police uncovered a chilling connection. What was the truth behind these disappearances? What dark secret was someone hiding? And how could a murderer remain undetected for so long, despite the growing evidence of a deadly pattern? In this documentary, we'll take you step by step through a twisted story of deceit, manipulation, and murder. The case that baffled investigators, revealing a killer whose method was as horrific as it was unimaginable. One that would forever change the way police investigate violent crimes. This is the story of how investigators, piecing together seemingly unrelated clues, finally uncovered the true identity of the man responsible for these monstrous acts. A man whose name would send a shiver down the spine of anyone who heard it. The acid bath killer. But how did a murderer after committing such atrocities remain undetected for so long? And what was the chilling motive behind these brutal killings? As the investigation unfolded, the answers would shock the nation. Join us as we dig into the dark, twisted tale of one of history's most notorious criminals and uncover the gruesome truth behind the murders of the acid bath killer. It all began in the foggy streets of post-war London, where the mundane routine of everyday life was disrupted by a series of unsettling events. People, seemingly ordinary men and women, began to vanish without a trace. At first, the disappearances seemed like unfortunate coincidences. A man walking home from the pub, a woman leaving her job in the city, both gone, their names whispered in hushed tones by concerned loved ones. But as the weeks turned into months, the pattern grew harder to ignore. More victims, more disappearances, all with one thing in common. The police had no answers. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no clues left behind. It was as though these people had simply disappeared into thin air. The first known case occurred in 1947, when a 34-year-old woman named Margarita Rita Banks vanished without a trace. Rita had been last seen leaving her workplace in central London. She told friends she was meeting a man, but after that, she simply vanished. Her family was frantic, but there were no leads, and no one could explain what had happened. At first, the police treated it as a possible runaway case, though nothing about Rita suggested she would ever leave behind her family and life in the city. In the weeks that followed, Rita's disappearance was joined by a string of similar cases. Men and women who, like her, were seemingly swallowed up by the city itself. Among the next victims was William Bill Maxwell, a 40-year-old businessman who disappeared in early 1948. He was last seen on a Monday morning, telling his colleagues he had a meeting with an investor. But when he failed to return home that evening, his wife became alarmed. Inquiries revealed nothing. Bill's business associates couldn't confirm the meeting, and his personal life appeared perfectly normal, without any signs of financial trouble or domestic discord. Then came the case of Dr. Frederick Freddie Houghton, a well-known dentist who disappeared just a month after Bill. Houghton was last seen leaving his office, heading home to his flat. However, as the days passed and no one could locate him, family and friends began to worry. His car was found abandoned a few miles from his apartment, with no indication of where he had gone. But it was not just the people who vanished that left behind questions. It was the eerie absence of evidence, the complete void that surrounded each case. No blood, no struggle, no sign of forced entry. The police were growing desperate. Each disappearance seemed to occur without any obvious connection. Yet, the more the cases piled up, the more the authorities began to notice disturbing patterns. The victims, though from different walks of life, all had something in common. They were all middle-aged, financially stable, and appeared to live quiet, uneventful lives. In fact, several had even been seen meeting with individuals who seemed to be nothing more than casual acquaintances. The pattern was too deliberate to be coincidence, but what was the connection? What could possibly tie together such a seemingly random group of victims? And most importantly, who was behind it all? As the cases remained unsolved, the police grew increasingly concerned, but they had no leads and no real clues to work with. With each passing day, the mystery deepened. Public fear began to mount, and whispers of an organized killer or even a series of coordinated abductions spread across the city. But there was one thing no one could fathom: that these disappearances weren't random, nor were they simple vanishings. The question wasn't why these people were disappearing, but how. How could someone make a person vanish into thin air without a single trace? Little did anyone know, the answer was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. As the months passed, the string of disappearances in London became impossible to ignore. The public's fear grew, and whispers of a ruthless killer began to circulate. The police, however, were still baffled. What could explain the eerie pattern of vanishings? And most perplexing of all, why was there no evidence, no trace of the victims left behind? It wasn't until late 1948 that investigators finally began to uncover the horrifying truth. The key to solving the case lay not in the disappearances themselves, but in the grisly method by which these victims had been disposed of. An unimaginable process so horrific, it would forever mark the case as one of the most chilling in criminal history. As the investigation continued, something strange began to surface, a common thread among the victims. Several had been known to visit a particular man in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. His name was John George Haigh, a man who lived in a modest house in the quiet suburb of Crawley, just outside of London. At first, Haigh seemed like an unlikely suspect. He was a man of average appearance, well-spoken, and appeared friendly to neighbors and associates. He had no known criminal history, and his occupation as a mechanic and occasional entrepreneur was not unusual. Haigh had even established a small business, buying and selling scrap metal, and was known to socialize with wealthy businessmen, some of whom were even among the missing. But the more investigators dug into his past, the more unsettling details began to surface. It was a breakthrough from a seemingly unrelated case that would change everything. A witness came forward, claiming to have seen a man who looked remarkably like Haigh near the area where several of the missing persons' belongings had been discovered. The pieces were starting to fall into place. As detectives retraced the steps of the victims, one by one, they began to uncover the grisly truth behind Haigh's sinister method. He had not just killed his victims, he had found a way to dispose of their bodies in a way that no one could trace. And it wasn't just a matter of hiding them. It was as if they had never existed at all. Haigh's preferred method of murder was as horrifying as it was methodical: sulfuric acid. Using his position in the scrap metal business, Haigh had access to large quantities of the industrial chemical, a substance capable of dissolving almost any organic matter, including human flesh. It was a tool he used with chilling precision. His technique was simple yet effective. Once he had lured his victims to his home under false pretenses, he would kill them, often by shooting them in the head or strangling them, and then proceed to dissolve their bodies in a barrel of sulfuric acid. For Haigh, It was a perfect method. It eliminated all traces of the body, leaving no forensic evidence to be found. The victim's remains were reduced to a dark, sludgy liquid that disappeared into the soil or sewage system, erasing any chance of discovery. But that wasn't the only terrifying aspect of his method. Haig's crimes went far beyond murder. He was meticulous. The bodies would not only be dissolved, the possessions of his victims would be carefully disposed of as well. In some cases, he even managed to forge documents in the victims' names, using their identities to swindle their families out of their money or property. But why did Haigh choose such a horrific and elaborate method of murder? The answer lay in his deep-seated desire for control. He was not only driven by greed, but also by a sadistic desire to make his victims disappear, to erase them completely from the world. The acid bath allowed him to wield power over life and death. He was in control of every aspect of the crime, from the luring of his victims to their final, gruesome end. In total, investigators would later uncover that Haigh was responsible for the deaths of at least 6 victims, though some estimates suggest the number could have been even higher. The victims ranged from businessmen to middle-aged women, all of whom had been lured into Haigh's home with promises of lucrative deals or social encounters. It was a pattern he had perfected. Haigh had no qualms about exploiting the trust of his victims, charming them with false promises, only to ensnare them in his deadly trap. One of Haigh's most notorious victims was William "Bill" Maxwell, the businessman who had disappeared earlier in the year. Bill had been introduced to Haigh through mutual business contacts. Haigh promised him a profitable deal involving scrap metal, which intrigued Maxwell, a man constantly seeking new ventures. However, after meeting Haigh at his house, Maxwell was never seen again. His body was found in a barrel, completely dissolved in sulfuric acid. Another victim, Dr. Frederick Houghton, the dentist, had also been lured by Haigh's business proposition. Haigh had even posed as a man of wealth, offering Dr. Houghton a share in a potential scrap metal business. But after meeting Haigh, Houghton was never seen again. His body, like the others, was dissolved in acid. Haigh had also managed to clear out the victim's apartment, liquidating his assets under false pretenses. It wasn't just the murders that shocked investigators. It was the complete lack of evidence. There were no bodies to examine and no physical signs of trauma or struggle. It wasn't until the discovery of human remains in Haigh's home that the full horror of his crimes came to light. When the police finally searched Haigh's property, they found remnants of dissolved bodies, a sticky, foul-smelling liquid that was later confirmed to contain human remains. This evidence would become the cornerstone of the investigation. It was then, finally, that the investigators began to realize the true extent of Haigh's depravity. He had managed to outsmart the authorities at every turn, leaving no trace of his victims behind. But the net was tightening, and soon Haigh would make a critical mistake, one that would seal his fate. The discovery of dissolved human remains in John George Haigh's home sent shockwaves through the investigation. But it wasn't until police uncovered crucial evidence that the full scope of his crimes began to take shape. The killer's method, so meticulous and insidious, had allowed him to evade detection for months, perhaps even years. But now, the net was closing in. The first breakthrough came in the form of William Maxwell's car, which had been found abandoned near Haigh's property. Although it had been wiped clean of any identifying fingerprints, detectives began to suspect that Haigh might be linked to the businessman's disappearance. Haigh had been a regular in the circles that Maxwell frequented, and the two had met only days before Maxwell's vanishing. Investigators began to focus their attention on him. One of the most significant turning points in the case came when a scrap metal dealer, who had worked with Haigh, came forward with a tip. The dealer had noticed something unusual. a barrel of liquid that Haigh had been trying to sell off under suspicious circumstances. The liquid had been thick, dark, and foul-smelling, unlike anything the dealer had ever seen before. He thought it odd at the time, but he hadn't thought much of it, until he heard about the disappearances. This revelation, though small, was enough to prompt detectives to take a deeper look at Haigh. They had already suspected him, but now they had a tangible lead. Armed with this new information, they obtained a search warrant for Haigh's house. What they found inside would haunt them forever. In Haigh's cellar, they discovered barrels, 4 in total, each containing the remnants of what appeared to be human bodies. The police were horrified as they realized what they had uncovered: human tissue, hair, and bones, all reduced to a dark, sludge-like substance. The acid had done its work perfectly, leaving behind only small fragments of bone and personal items belonging to the victims: pocket watches, rings, and other small valuables. But it wasn't just the barrels that implicated Haigh. Investigators found forged documents in his office, detailing transactions where he had sold the victims' possessions and even taken out loans in their names. Haigh had been methodically erasing his victims from existence, both physically and financially. As the evidence mounted, Haigh's earlier denials began to crumble. He had been careful with his words, denying any involvement in the disappearances, but he couldn't deny the damning physical evidence that had been uncovered. In a confession that shocked the police, Haigh finally admitted to the murders, though he downplayed the gruesome nature of his crimes, claiming they had been driven by financial desperation. Yet his motive remained unclear. Haigh's statement to police, and later to the court, suggested that he killed for money, but the bizarre nature of his method, dissolving bodies in acid, erasing all traces, suggested something darker: a need for control, a chilling satisfaction in making people disappear completely. The evidence was overwhelming, and within days John George Haigh was arrested and charged with multiple murders. The case, once shrouded in mystery, now had its answer. But the public's horror was just beginning. Haigh's trial, which began in late 1949, captivated the nation. The details of his crimes, including his method of body disposal, shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The man who had seemed so ordinary was now revealed to be one of the most depraved killers in British history. The evidence against him was irrefutable, and after a brief deliberation, the jury found him guilty of 6 murders. Haigh was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence carried out on August 10, 1949. His execution marked the end of one of the most horrifying crime sprees in British history. Haigh's crimes left an indelible mark on criminal investigations, highlighting the terrifying potential for manipulation and control. His legacy is a chilling reminder of how an ordinary man can conceal the darkest of secrets until the truth is finally revealed.